What's going on YouTube? Josh here checking in, back with another video. Today we're doing a little bit of a research review, haven't done that in a while, and I think it's time because we've got another good study by the good old Brad Schoenfeld. This study is called Effects of Resistance Training Frequency on Measures of Muscle Hypertrophy, a Systemic Review and Meta-Analysis. This was just published, so hot off the press. So as the title implies, this is a meta-analysis. So this is not one study studying 20 subjects. What they did is they had a bunch of inclusion criteria for studies that they thought would be relevant, looking at training frequency and how that affects hypertrophy. They ended up going with 10 different studies, and then they essentially tried to combine these studies, look at the results, and see what they find. Now, as I mentioned, they're studying training frequency. So it's important to note that training frequency can mean a few things depending on how you're talking about it. So training frequency basically refers to how often you train. Now, sometimes people will say training frequency per week or training frequency per body part. They are often similar, but not always the same, as you can figure out. So in this study, they primarily had sufficient data to study the training per body part, not so much training per week, because as I said, they're not always the same. And what they found in this study is, as you may guess, training more is often better. Well, sort of, right? So they basically compared training body parts 1, twice, or 3 times per week. And what they found when they compiled the data from various studies is that generally twice per week is better than once per week. They didn't really have sufficient data to prove that 3 times per week is better than 2 or 1, so that question still remains to be seen. What sort of an effect did they see, though, between the difference of hypertrophy that you might see training a body part, say, once per week versus twice per week? Now, as a percentage change of total hypertrophy, the difference is about 3%. Now, over a lifetime, that could be a substantial difference, but in the short term, probably not that huge. What does this tell us? You probably should be training more than less, right? I think that's kind of the common knowledge, but that effect is not going to be remarkable over the short term, right? So it's only a 3% change that they saw. Now, one thing that's really important to point out, oftentimes people will say that this is a meta-analysis. So it's the top level of knowledge. This is the best kind of a study because they basically look at a bunch of other studies and now they're compiling those results. So now instead of looking at 20 people, now they could look at 100 people, for example. And of course, it's always better to look at more subjects than less because, there are outliers and stuff like that. Well, the thing with a meta-analysis is there's this issue called heterogeneity. And that's what basically that's the fancy science statistical term for saying that the studies are different, right? So these studies are not all looking at the same kind of people. They were not all performed under the same circumstances, all right? So that's one of the limitations of a meta-analysis. When you're doing a meta-analysis, you're basically stuck with the best evidence that you have. Now, in this case, of the 10 studies they reviewed, 8 of the studies were actually in untrained individuals. So the question arises, if only 20% of these studies in the meta-analysis were in individuals that have a fair amount of training experience, bodybuilders, or even just recreational lifters for that matter, will these results apply to that group? I would argue that there is probably sufficient evidence to say that it applies to them. The question is, would you see more of a, say, specific result if you did a meta-analysis, if you had enough data to look at only trained subjects? That would be something interesting to see, although quite frankly, there's just not enough literature out there, right? Another thing to consider is this is only looking at hypertrophy, all right? There is a clear relationship between strength and hypertrophy, but that's not to say that they are exactly a perfect relationship, all right? So there is a possibility, perhaps, that if we're just looking at strength and we're not as concerned about hypertrophy, if you were trained a certain way, that perhaps increasing frequency would be better. A lot of people quote this Norwegian powerlifting study from a few years back. It was actually only published and presented in a scientific conference. It was never actually published in a full text journal. So, this was a study basically showing a great improvement in their strength as well as hypertrophy when they switched to a volume equated 6-day per week frequency. So this is something just to consider when you're talking about powerlifting strength and stuff like that. So in closing, the results of the study, 2 days better than 1 day. We don't know if 3 days a week is good, although, there's certainly a possibility. Now, I'll leave it at that as far as the study is concerned. One thing I will say, just, in case you're new to this sort of thing, one of the reasons the reason behind this, right? Because I'm always asking, why is this the case? Why do we see this? Now, one of the main hypotheses that isn't discussed in this paper, just because it's not really, it's a little bit more on the based on the physiology of it, is basically that the reason why we think that increased frequency is probably better for hypertrophy has to do with the way that your muscles generate new proteins to build new muscle. Okay, so this is called muscle protein synthesis. That period is peaked and gone within usually 36 hours, right? So that would mean that a day and a half after you train, you're basically, you've kind of exhausted the gains, so to speak, of that specific workout. So if you've exhausted the gains that you're going to get from that one workout, this is assuming you're natural, you're not taking steroids or something which sort of changes the formula, then theoretically, you should be able to train again and sort of stimulate that muscle protein synthesis response in basically every 2 days, which would give you a training frequency of 3 days per week. Again, we don't know if that's the case, but just so you understand the physiology behind why this is the case and why we think that muscle hypertrophy responds in this way to increase frequency. So anyway, guys, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to give this video a like and definitely post your comments in the comment section below. I'll include a link to this article on the PubMed. And that's all I have for you on this one. I'll catch you guys in the next video.